Welcome to the Smart Thinking Podcast. This is my dad, Ted.
Welcome to the Smart Thinking Podcast. I'm your host, Ted Knightsky. All right, buckle up. This is a great conversation for anyone who works with other people, anyone who supports other people, anyone who serves other people, because it is a conversation about two things converging together: strengths, engagement, and how those two things can really amplify and support everyone you serve, support, live around, or love. This conversation with Emily and Tim was recorded just a couple of weeks ago, and I felt it was very timely to put it out now because it will help us as we enter the second part of the school year, work year, or just tomorrow, in ways that we can support others as we work to build Buffalo mindsets all around us. This is a leadership podcast. This is a reflection podcast. This is a grow yourself type of podcast episode. So sit back, enjoy this great conversation between me, Tim, and Emily. So welcome to the Smart Thinking Podcast. This is Ted Knightsky with two really cool people that one I met this summer and one I met a few years ago. Both of them deeply immersed in the work at Gallup in Omaha, Nebraska. One a strengths expert, one an engagement expert. Both of them researchers, both of them doctors, and both of them pretty amazing. So Emily Lorenz and Tim Hodges, Dr. Emily, Dr. Tim, joining me here today. And Emily, welcome to the podcast. Could you tell us a little bit about what you do at Gallup?
Absolutely, Ted. Thanks for having me. So in my role at Gallup, I'm a methodologist, which means I have the pleasure of designing research studies for a living. It's quite fun. My background is in educational measurement and statistics, as well as business administration and management. I know that's a mouthful, but it basically means I do research with schools and organizations to help them solve their most pressing problems. One of my favorite parts of my role at Gallup is that I get to do a lot of research on how the national U.S. workforce is doing, as well as a lot of research on our Clifton Strengths assessment and outcomes of strengths-based workplace cultures and strengths-based higher education institutions. So I've had a chance to collaborate with Tim on quite a few projects there as well.
That's really cool. And I imagine as a young girl in fourth grade, you were like, I want to work with qualitative and quantitative data. What led you down this pathway?
Oh, great question. So when I was in college, I loved psychology. And I actually worked at a call center. And everybody else who worked at the call center didn't really love it, but it was the highest paying on-campus job. I thought it was fascinating because I loved how you could ask the same question and different people would give such different answers based on their lived experiences. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. So I had a professor who noticed that I was the only student in the class that really enjoyed that aspect of it. And she helped encourage me to pursue a field in quantitative psychology, which is essentially measurement. Then I got into the standardized assessment industry for a little bit. In graduate school, I worked at Iowa testing programs, and I loved the space. I learned to love education research, but I realized I wanted to do more with people and more with psychology. And so pursuing a role that was that perfect Venn diagram between helping people make their organizations better and doing really cool research that actually makes an impact was what stood out to me. And I took an internship at Gallup. They let me stay, and it's kind of how I ended up here.
And tell us a little bit just about your educational journey. So where did you grow up and like go to high school and then college and grad school and doctoral school?
I went to I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, born and raised. Went to high school at Cedar Rapids Prairie. If anyone in the audience is from around Iowa, you might be familiar with it. I did
Big
my
shout
undergrad
out
at
to the Prairie.
Yep, Eastern Iowa. I did my undergrad at University of Northern Iowa, where I studied psychology, and I got a certificate in industrial organizational psychology, which is where I really started my love for business. And, for grad school, I was determined to go to one of the coasts. I wanted to get out of Iowa. That was a goal of mine, but I ended up deciding to tour a graduate program at the University of Iowa called Educational Measurement and Statistics, and I fell in love with it. And so I abandoned my dreams of moving to the coast, and I moved half an hour away, and got my PhD at the University of Iowa. One of the cool things about that program is they make every PhD student specialize in a third area. So we get expertise in education, in measurement statistics, and then for my third area, I chose business administration and management, which is where I ended up learning a lot more about how to do research in organizations, specifically on things like engagement, employee attitudes and outcomes and performance, et cetera.
Oh, and that's an area that I love to talk about is employee engagement and then supercharging that with strengths, which leads us to Tim. Tim, if you could tell us a little bit about what you do at the University of Nebraska and then also with Gallup.
Sure. Well, the University of Nebraska part started for me as a student, but during my time as a student, I really learned about Gallup and got going with a career there and worked full time at Gallup for about 20 years, doing research around strengths and employee engagement and well-being, and then really kind of between research and practitioner, was a manager internally for teams for several of those years, and then when I finished my own PhD work, I wanted to spend more time with clients, and most of my clients were K-12 school districts or education organizations, higher ed. Then about 7 years ago, started working with the University of Nebraska Clifton Strengths Institute, where I'm a professor of management and executive director of the institute there. I have a half-time teaching, half-time administration role. So my teaching is I teach about 1,000 first-year students in the College of Business each year, a course around Introduction to Strengths. And then I teach in the MBA program and a couple other entrepreneurship and leadership courses as well. And on the administrative side, the Clifton Strengths Institute exists to really help on this campus in the College of Business and to help other campuses around the country and anyone else who's really interested in strengths to learn about their own strengths and create classrooms and experiences for people to grow through the lens of what's right with them. It's a good legacy kind of connection here. Don Clifton started his strengths research here on this campus about 75 years ago, and the work continues today. So love what I get to do.
And Tim, I saw both you and Emily when you were kind enough to invite me to come to Lincoln this summer at the institute that you held over the summer with really global leaders, university leaders. It was a very, very cool day. And one of the things that kind of popped out that I guess I never really put into context before is that Don Clifton is really kind of the grandfather of positive psychology. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and just maybe one of the fun stories you have about, knowing him or learning from him?
Yeah, the American Psychological Association actually gave Don that title. He was the father of strengths-based psychology and the grandfather of positive psychology. And a lot of the origins of that field, it was about 25 years ago now, where Don was studying about strengths and engagement and well-being and realized there were a few other people who were studying things in this field. Marty Seligman was the president of the American Psychological Association around that time. And so there were a few kind of real giants of the field that came together and launched what a generation later is pretty commonplace in psychology now, where we talk about hope and engagement and well-being and strengths and resilience and grit and lots of other positive things. Don was a math student as a Regent Scholar at the University of Nebraska undergrad, and analytical was one of his top 5 strengths. And I think there was something there where he kind of turned people into an equation and realized if the traditional approach to psychology was about eliminating weaknesses, getting rid of our negatives, mathematically that only gets us up to 0. And I think he wondered what's possible on the other side of the ledger. How good can people be, and how can we develop that potential? So it's a good kind of connection between his analytical mathematical brain and his desire to help people learn and grow and develop. One story, our office in Lincoln used to be on 68th and O Street. And there was one day where Don tossed me the keys to the Prius, which he was the first person in Nebraska to have a Prius. That was his futuristic talent, I think. But anyway, tossed me the keys to the car and said, "Hey, we got to head downtown." I said, "Where are we going?" He goes, "Well, we're giving a speech at the governor's mansion." I said, "Who's we?" Well, I'll do the speech, you do the driving. So that worked out. So I'm driving down the road, hands at 10 and 2, don't want to wreck the boss's car, right? And anyway, it got kind of awkwardly quiet for a few blocks on this drive. And I'm not super comfortable with silence. And so I thought, did I say something wrong or what? So I said, "Don, what are you thinking about?" And he looked up, and we were driving past a stretch of O Street, right past Wyuka Cemetery, which is, about 4 or 5 blocks long. And he said, I'm thinking about how many people died never knowing what their strengths are. And I thought, this guy is sold out on this idea of strengths development. So it was a big part of his mission, and really was fun to get to overlap the beginning of my career with the end of his life. He passed away in 2003, and the legacy that he left is, he lived a pretty great life, but I think the legacy he left's even bigger.
Yeah, I would agree. And how neat that you get to carry that torch, and that the amount of time you and Emily get to spend together, and just all the different really unique strengths that the different people at Gallup offer, and it just all in the different ways. And that kind of leads me to my next question here is, so this summer when I saw both of you speak, immediately, I remember telling you both like, oh, we're going to have a conversation this year, because there are a lot of the people who listen know their Clifton Strengths. Many of the people who listen either participate in or facilitate the Gallup Strength Finder, as well as the Gallup engagement work, or the Clifton Strength Finder, as well as the engagement work. And I want to talk a little bit about how those two things marry. And Emily, I want to start with you a little bit with what are some new trends coming out? The world just keeps hovering around 33, 32, drops down to 30 for a quarter, up to 33. I'm going to a school district tonight. I'm really excited. They're up to 47th percentile of engaged staff. What are some things that are some new and recent learnings that are really intriguing for you and that can support, individual engagement?
Great question, Ted. The trend that we're seeing right now that is the most interesting to me is that there's been a huge decline in workers knowing what's expected of them at work. So in our engagement science, being able to know what is expected of you and have those clear expectations is one of the fundamental things you need to have in order to be engaged at work. But over the past few years, we've seen a huge decline. I'm talking big. So in 2015, about 61% of the US workforce strongly agreed, I know what's expected of me at work. We're down to 46% nationally. Quite a significant drop. There's been a lot of things that have happened over the past few years. As you know, our workplaces were really greatly disrupted when COVID happened. A lot of people working from home for the first time, et cetera. But now that we're back to this new, I'll call it quote unquote normal, we're still seeing that decline happening. We thought it would stop once people started, getting their work from home and return to office policies in place, but it hasn't stopped declining. So that's, I would say, the most alarming thing that we're seeing, especially since expectations is such a strong driver of everyone's engagement at work. I mean, imagine showing up and not knowing what you're supposed to be doing. That's disruptive, and it makes it hard to do really good work, and it makes it hard to feel good about your work.
And when you guys scratch the surface on that, because that's Q1, right? That's I know what's expected of me at work. What are you finding as being the gap, or what are people identifying in the qualitative research around that?
So one of the things that we are seeing, and this is a very, very complicated relationship, I will say, remote work had a lot to do with it, but remote work isn't the only cause of it. I think when people started going, let's say Tim and I have been working together for 10 years. We have a rhythm. We have our day to day. I know I'm going to see Tim at in the morning at 8 a.m. and I'm going to ask him in the hall, hey, how's it going? What are you up to today? Get a chance to ask for clarification on something that I have going on that day, because Tim's been a mentor of mine. Suddenly I don't get to see Tim every single day anymore. And now I have to go out of my way to email him to get that information, to, send him a Teams message or a Slack message, etc. But not everybody who started working remotely had that same experience. When we dive deeper, a lot of it comes back to the quality of the management for the people who are in that transition or who are experiencing that serious change with their role. It's less about where they're working from, even though that was very disruptive for a lot of people in their roles. And it comes back to how well their manager is managing them. Because if the manager is setting clear expectations, changing what's going on in their environment or where they're clocking in from isn't going to be as disruptive. But if the manager's not doing a good job holding people accountable or making sure people are crystal clear on what actually is expected of them and what their performance metrics are, there's going to be a lot more fuzziness, if you will, in what's going on in someone's day to day.
I think that's interesting because a lot of the work that I'll do with school systems, that is always a low one. And I'll be really honest, it kind of bothers me. I was a teacher, middle school, high school teacher, and I don't know that I would have scored I know it's expected of me low. But then when we dug into it, it was all the changing exterior forces that, like you said, that people start to identify, like the non-controllables that got them really, really frustrated. So that's a really cool correlation that you just identified. And
Absolutely. And when we look at just teachers, they saw an even greater decline throughout the course of the pandemic in their clarity of expectations because at that point in time, a lot of them became, they had to do things a lot more differently than some of the other, 9 to 5 white collar workers who were just able to clock in from their laptop on their dining room table. So
yeah, I mean,
a lot.
being married to a teacher and then having two kids at home during that time period, it was pretty awesome that, Meg would come downstairs with a nice top on and then flannel pajama pants, teach her class. The kids would be doing the same thing. And then they'd bounce back upstairs. And then, of course, they go back to work and they go back to school. And there's this weird transition as if, that 3 month period of time was actually like 3 years. And it was so difficult to go back to because we learned so many things that I think show up in other areas of the Q12. Like I really enjoyed my flexibility. I liked working whenever I wanted to. And I never had something like that before. This kind of on-time ability to tune in there. That's really interesting. And Tim, do you have anything to add on that one?
Well, I think the core need that is underneath that question, I know it's expected of me at work, is really focus me and help me understand, clear out the clutter. We talk a lot about burnout these days in the workplace. And one of the things we've learned at Gallup is that burnout's not so much about the hours worked, but it's about the number of things you're doing that are covering for other people while you're at work. And I think there's a real connection between question 1 and question 3 on the engagement survey, where question 3 says, at work, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. So that's about being known. And, I know what my strengths are. My manager knows what my strengths are. We try and craft a job that's really a great fit for me. And I'm clear on those expectations. So I was just working with a client this morning, a higher ed institution, a couple thousand employees responded to the survey. And those two items were low, even among long-serving employees. So just because, we tend to do it pretty well in orientation where we're clear about expectations. We want to learn about who the person is and all that. But people who've been there 10 or 20 years still need to feel like they belong and they're focused and known. And so I think it matters for all of us. It's not just an onboarding issue.
And I think you tell me what you think of this. So I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago, I saw that trend occurring and I had put together a process to help specifically K-12 institutions. Because what I found out when I started to ask was there were no very clear processes to identify your job description. So there wasn't like a third grade teacher job description. There wasn't a high school social studies job description. And instead there was this inference like, well, you're a teacher, go be a teacher. And it didn't say things like you're expected to have these types of qualities and skills. Now, in the same school districts and systems, the maintenance person had a very clear job description. You must be able to carry 50 pounds, problem solve, work with others. But there weren't any for the professional level. Is that something you see in other industries, or do you have any suggested strategies for systems that do struggle with that Q1 of I know what's expected for me?
I definitely think it's not exclusive to education, Ted. I think every industry is really struggling with this. Now there are some very technical ways you can go about doing a job audit, job leveling to really understand what are the responsibilities of that role, what actually are the demands of that job. But if anyone's listening who is having people on their team where they themselves are struggling with clarifying expectations, one of the things that I like to talk to my clients about is really sharing the burden of clarifying expectations. And what I mean by that is, Ted, if I'm giving you instructions on how to do something, My part of the burden for clarity of expectations is that I need to try to be as specific as possible with what it is you are supposed to be doing and what it is you are not supposed to be doing. And if I'm unclear in any aspect of that, Ted, then it's your responsibility to ask me for more information. And I think that symbiotic relationship between me trying to be as clear as possible and trusting that you will ask me for clarification if I'm not has been really helpful with the organizations that I've worked with and with people that I've mentored or worked alongside. I know, Tim, do you have any other approaches you use with your clients?
No, I think my favorite question to ask when we're talking about the results is what would a 5 look like? On that question, it's a relatively easy question. So on a 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree, we anchor the endpoints and kind of let people decide what it means in between. But if you're like a 4.2, you might say, well, that's a pretty good score. But a 4.2 would be kind of right in the middle of the database. So it's a pretty easy question. A lot of times we're not talking about people giving a 1 or a 2 or a 3. Usually it's close, but not quite. And it's just what's that last 10% look like? So I love to ask, what would it mean to strongly agree that what's expected of you at work? And usually it's not that big a deal. And it's just a simple strategy that if we're intentional about it, it doesn't take much to move it.
Oh,
Recently, Tim, we had a chance to look back at some of our national trends on this, and we explored what are some of the driving factors for people who don't have clear expectations and do have clear expectations. And we found that the number one differentiator was whether or not they knew what their coworkers were expected to do. So that goes back to what you were saying earlier, Ted. Is it the history teacher's responsibility to do this? Is it the social studies teacher's responsibility to do this? If we're all working together on a team, if I know what Ted's going to do and I know what Tim's going to do, I can fill in the blanks and know what I'm supposed to do. But if I don't know what I'm supposed to do and I don't know what anybody else is doing, then nothing's going to get done really well. There's not any room to build accountability for each other.
well, and that leads to frustration, intentional disengagement, comparison, looking for evidence that the other people have an easier day than I do. And then we get all wonky and weird. And I really like both of your answers to that. And Tim, I love the simplicity of, well, what would we need to do to move us up 0.5? What would you need to know so that you weren't in that wondering stage? That is a wonderful way to, kind of close that gap, and so simple. So thank you for that. Okay, so I want to play ping pong now and go over to strengths for a moment. So I'm going to lead with Tim here. And a couple of years ago, I went through my Clifton Strengths training, became a coach. I've coached now lots and lots of people using the tool. And I want to hear your answer for this, and then I want to hear Emily's, because I run retreats now with senior leaders around the strengths work. And I usually lead out with 4 questions, everybody around the room. And this question was a really fun one this year with that group. So I'd like to hear your answers. So, Tim, in the last year, what do people who love you the most lean into you for the most from your strengths?
For me, it's probably my maximizer. It is my number one theme, but it's really about how do we take something that's working and see if we can make it better. Whether that's a teenager who's working on an essay for a college application and they want me to edit, I'm way better. You lead with a lot of ideation, Ted. You're great. You got an idea a minute. I'm not naturally great at brainstorming. Ideation is literally my number 34 theme on the report. But if you can give me something that's good and almost done and ask me if I can make it just a little bit better, game on. So I've found that role in life is one that I really enjoy, and it's something I get to do every day at work. We had a great organization here when I showed up. I'm not a turnaround artist. I'm not a startup genius, but give me something that's good and ask me if I can make it great, and I can get pretty excited about that. You probably hear a little of my belief in that answer too, but I'd say maximizer.
Yeah. How about you, Emily?
I think it's my positivity. And I also lead with maximizer. I'm really big into theme dynamics, so thinking about the two themes interacting. I, when a colleague or a teammate or if someone in my family or friend circle comes to me with a problem, I like to help them make it better. but I also like to bring a silver lining. So, even though this is really frustrating or this is tough right now, think about how great it's going to be in a few months once we get through this, and helping them navigate that is something I think I've seen like my friends and colleagues gravitate towards me for, and it's really interesting to have that strengths-based perspective to it.
Oh, that's
Future
awesome.
answer. You don't get off the hook on this one. What do you say?
Yeah, well, mine is an activator, like kind of the GSD strength, right? Get stuff done, get people moving. I get a lot of calls coaching to like courage, like, hey, I'm thinking about, and it's always the same thing. What is stopping you? Let's go. What could possibly happen? What do you need to do? And that's why like the strengths world and language and understanding those things. And for me, the two that I probably stacked the most, and Tim identified it, it was ideation and activator. Like, what's your problem? Have you thought of these three things? What do you need from me to do it? And I mean that's probably where I go the most with those I love, like kids, family, people I serve that I'm really, really close to. And the inverse question that I always ask as well is, what strengths of yours can occasionally also be your kryptonite?
And my default setting is to be excited about it, to tell them, I'm sorry to hear that. It's going to be okay. So let's say your dog just died, and you come in, you're kind of bummed out today. My immediate normal reaction would be, that's okay. You're going to get a better dog someday. And even though I'm probably right, that's kind of a jerk thing to say right in the moment there, right? I need to be better about saying, I'm sorry about your dog. That sounds hard. Tell me about a great memory you've had with your dog, or, and then just kind of be okay with that and not try and solve it in the moment. Positivity is about energy and is about bringing energy to situations. And there can be a tendency to move on too quickly with that theme. So I've received some coaching about that, and I'm more intentional to slow down sometimes when other people might want to and need to sit in something and grieve for a minute before we move on, or even more than a minute. So that would be one I'm working on.
Yeah. And how about you, Emily?
I'm gonna go with my number 6, arranger. This is one I've been learning a lot more about recently. I've gotten some strengths coaching and feedback on this one as well. I think people who lead with arranger are really good at making a puzzle out of things and putting the pieces together in a way that makes it just so. And I think as part of that, sometimes I tend to see things as a puzzle that needs to be solved or can be solved. And sometimes I'm thinking so much about the processes and the objectives and the strategy that I forget to think about the people involved and what their strengths are and how I can meet their needs when I'm trying to put together this puzzle. I think a good example of this, sometimes when I'm putting together the puzzle, I forget that someone on my team is a really strong activator. And so I need to communicate about what we're going to do next a little bit differently to her so she can stay engaged and excited when I'm still trying to put together the pieces. Because if she knows, and Ted, maybe you can relate to this, she knows that a project's coming down the pipeline and I'm still putting together the pieces, it's going to drive her nuts. What about you, Ted?
Yeah, so mine is I'm probably gonna say woo would be my kryptonite on occasion. I come in like I'm on fire and I'm trying to convince the world of everything and get them going. And I can sometimes I can look past the reality of the situation. Like, it's okay. We've got good problems. We can do this. And then everybody commits to it. And I walk out of the room, and then later on, they'll be like, oh my goodness, what did we just say we were going to do? And that's where sometimes that can act as a kryptonite for me, is I don't necessarily see that, because I layer that, I stack woo, positivity, activator, strategic, futuristic, and I can just go into like, it's going to be okay. We're going to be all right. And sometimes all of the other things that are really low for me, like harmony and consistency and being deliberative and disciplined. I mean, those are literally my low 4. Those people are sitting there looking at me like, we need details, we need dates, we need times. We're going to try to, and I'm like, who cares? Let's just get in the van. And they're like, yeah, you're killing us, Smalls. You're killing us.
And that's
And
the
I think
beauty of partnerships. Oh, I was going to say that's the beauty of partnerships. You can surround yourself with the people who maybe have strengths that you don't have, and that's the best way to get things done, because you can do what you do best, and so can they. Tim,
Which
what were you
I'm
going to
sorry.
say?
Yeah, I just think about strengths being such a, we need to regulate and self-regulate, right? So there's times, if you think of your strengths like a dial, there's times you really need to dial it up. And there's times where you probably need to dial it back a little bit. And the more perceptive we are about the situations and the rooms we walk into, how do you want to show up? I mean, not everyone can handle all of Ted at once, the first interaction, right?
No,
But
you're very
once you
correct.
get to know him, it's pretty great, right?
Yeah. That leads me to my next question, again, kind of combining the two. But Emily, in your current work, you had sent me some different components of like new pieces on recognition and workplace components like that. Help me with that. And then Tim, if we could interweave like how people can use their strengths to support, this newest research or newer research on supporting employee engagement with this recognition component, and how regardless of where your 34 fall, that we can get into that space and support people.
Over the last few years, Gallup and an organization called WorkHuman have partnered really closely together on a lot of really cool research about recognition in the workplace. One of the things that we've really been focusing on through this research program is how to make the workplace more human-centric, right? We bring our whole selves to work every day. If I had a bad night last night or a bad morning, to the best of my ability, I'm going to try not to bring that to work with me, but it might show up. And so a lot of our research focuses on how to help people be who they are. And there's a lot of strengths involved in that as well when they are at work. I want to take a second to talk about what we've found in our research to be the 5 really important elements of recognition at work that you can use and think through and leverage in a strategic way to help your organization and to help people on your team who may be struggling. So the first of these pillars is that recognition should be fulfilling. It should be that right amount of recognition. People should feel like the amount of recognition they're getting makes sense for the amount of work that they do. Next needs to be authentic. So it's not just a checklist thing. You don't want to send out that, hey, great job, canned email to every single person who does something. Only 31% of people strongly agree that the recognition they receive at work is authentic, which is kind of sad and staggering.
Oh, what was 31?
31%. Yep. It's pretty low.
Can I just ask you like what, so, or, well, you'll get into it, but later on, I'd like to come back to to Tim's point, what does authentic, recognition look like? Okay.
Absolutely. The third pillar that we've identified is whether it's equitable. Now, this does not mean that everybody's getting the same amount. This is about whether people who are doing similar things have similar amounts of recognition. So if Tim's an all-star and I'm not doing really well, I would expect that Tim gets more recognition for his work than I do. Next, the fourth pillar is whether it's embedded in the culture. So this is whether employees feel like recognition is actually an important part of their organization's culture. Is it woven through the day-to-day experiences of that organization? And last, but certainly not least, and I think this ties in the strongest to our strengths-based piece, is whether or not it's personalized. So one size doesn't fit all. If I'm, giving a Starbucks gift card to everybody on my team, that's going to mean a lot to some people who really love that cup of coffee, that pumpkin spice latte on their way to work, and it's not going to mean a lot. It's going to feel, insincere to some people who maybe don't drink coffee or don't love Starbucks. So only 11% of people in the U.S. workforce have actually been asked by somebody at work how they like to be recognized. Again, another really low. I mean, the bar's pretty low on that one, if you will.
Going into strengths here, Tim, how do people, what are the people who are good at recognizing people? Like where are they going to fall with their strengths? Because I've found over the course of my life, a lot of this also has to do with your personal formation in life. Like, did you get a lot of praise when you were younger in school? Do you expect it? Do you need it? And, people bang on the generations who are, under 35, like, oh, they need medals, they need this, they need that. No, they grew up kind of knowing where they stood. So how can we lean into those 5 things, Tim, using strengths?
Yeah, one of the best questions I think you can ask in coaching around strengths is to ask people about a peak experience or a time when they've been at their best. And as it relates to recognition, I love to ask people, what's the best recognition you've ever received? And usually there's a couple of good follow-up questions. What was it for? Who did it come from? How was it delivered? Who was the first person you told about it afterwards? And that tells you a lot about not just their strengths, but kind of their value system and what really rings the bell for them. For some people, it is a Starbucks gift card because they buy coffee on the way to work every day, and they're over budget already and having conversations about that at home. And so that's the perfect gift. For others, it's a handwritten note that no one else knows about. For others, it's on stage at the end of the year. And so, if you ask people, how do you like to be recognized? Oh, don't worry about it, I'm fine. I mean, most people would kind of push away that question. But if you ask them to tell you about the best recognition they've ever received, I've had people reduced to tears answering that question because it still feels big. It still feels good. On the engagement survey, the question is, in the last 7 days, I've received recognition or praise for doing good work. And some people think about that literally as having been in the last 7 calendar days. Most people, I think, look at that and say, if it's been a long time, so long that I have to think about when it happened, it's probably been too long. But I've received recognition, I suspect you both have as well, where every time I think about it, it kind of gets to count again, right? So I think if you can really dig into that best recognition you've ever received, and then as a manager, as a coach, be thinking about, okay, what was that for? Who was it with? How can I replicate something like that moving forward when the time is right? So, and people are all different. So you gotta it's okay to take notes and think about that. I don't remember everything everybody tells me, but after a meeting like that, I jot down some notes or put a calendar reminder for a few weeks out, and hopefully then it'd prompt me to do it better next time.
Emily, what is the best recognition you've ever received?
I had a feeling you were going to ask this, Ted. I think the best recognition I ever received was from one of my former interns. We started off the summer. She's an incredibly talented analyst and researcher, but we started off the summer kind of struggling because she wasn't really confident in herself and her abilities, and she felt a little out of place because she didn't have the same technical background as some of the other interns. And I worked with her through and myself and a few other people on my team gave her some really supportive and strong mentorship, and helped her find her path, figure out what her strengths were. She still works here at Gallup and she does amazing. And I think the best recognition I ever received was a note from her saying that I changed her life. And it felt to me like out of all the time that I had invested in helping her, like that was the most impactful thing that I think I did that entire year, because, I helped someone else understand their strengths, and in turn, they were able to be more engaged as an employee, but also feel better about themselves as a person. So I still have that note. I keep it by my desk to remind myself, when things are tough, or when I'm struggling with a situation, or when I'm working with someone who I think maybe isn't using their strengths in the best way. That, it just reminds me that we can help each other by appreciating each other for who we actually are. And I don't know, I get a little choked up thinking about it, because to me, those conversations didn't take a ton of time, but they had a big impact because of that strengths-based perspective.
Yeah, I love that. And as soon as Tim asked that question, I don't know what he said after that, because all I was thinking about was I'll go back and re-listen to you, Tim. It was probably really good, but I couldn't stop thinking about what was mine. And mine was 4 years ago, I turned 50 years old, and some of my old soccer players decided to collect stories about me and mail them to me. And I just sat there with tear-filled eyes, because again, I think as leaders, we don't really recognize that every moment of the day we're influencing other people. And here were 25-year-old memories about young Coach Knightsky, and then how they coach now, or what they did. And just, I think that's one of those pieces, to your point, where I don't really personally need a lot of recognition, for me. And I know that significance and recognition aren't necessarily the same, but significance is pretty low for me, and I don't really think about it or care about it that much. But when all of a sudden you get that, just that really nice squeeze to the heart, if other people can replicate that for you in an authentic way, then that's pretty powerful. What was yours, Tim?
I A recent example for me, really being invited back is great recognition, because that suggests maybe they just don't know there were other options. But I think it suggests you create a little bit of value, and my relator loves ongoing relationships and that kind of connection. But as a professor, some of the best recognition I can get is I've been invited to several students' weddings. Maybe I was supposed to invite professors to weddings. I didn't even think about that, but it suggests to me it was more than just a class they took, but a person they trusted and they kind of want to invite into the next phase of their life. And this Saturday I had an early coffee with the former student who is doing a great job, making more money than most of his professors ever would hope to. And I mean, just really crushing it 3 years into his career. And he's got an opportunity now to change. He'd been recruited to another role. He got an offer, and he just wanted to meet and see what I thought and kind of talk that through. And just being invited into some of those moments when people are going through big decisions is really, really special and something I value a lot. So anytime you kind of get invited into those decisions, or if you're the first one to hear about, something big that's going on in their lives, that means a lot to me.
And I think this boils down to a really cool concept, which is that we have, in some way or another, really gotten deep in the sphere and lane of trust for someone else. And they just really leaned into what we offer them and what they do. And I think that that's a really, really important piece. And when you said that, I actually did invite one of my professors to my wedding, Dr. Terry Rarig. Guy was a life changer for me. So I think that's, I think if they make that big of a difference, that it means a lot. Emily, I want to go back to, I wish that the 5 pillars spelled something so it was easier to remember, but it's FAEEP, so FAOP, but I'm an educator, so that's what we'll call it, the FAOP process. But authentic.
Sounds Dutch or something, I don't know.
Right. Authentic. You said that was pretty low, 31% or something. What does authentic recognition feel or look like?
It feels real. It's one of those things you know it when you're getting it. And I would ask, anyone listening, and Ted, Tim, you maybe imagine this as well. Have you ever gotten a thank you note that just feels like they wrote the same thing to everybody? Yeah, that feels very different than when you get the thank you note that says, thank you so much for, you brought so much impact because of XYZ specific reasons. I really appreciate these very specific things about you, whether it's your personality, the way you did this, the way you did that. It shows people that you were there, you were present, you were paying attention, and you genuinely appreciate them, not just for what they did, but also for who they are as a person and how they brought themselves to whatever it is that you're thanking them or appreciating them or recognizing them for. So it can't feel like a checklist thing. If you've got recognized people on your to-do list, that's one thing. I mean, it's good that you're doing it, but maybe not as the most authentic. Where it becomes authentic, where it becomes a part of that culture and the way people interact in an organization, is when we are rewiring ourselves to think, wow, that was great. My next step is to acknowledge that greatness, whether it's through a note or through a quick email or a message or through nominating someone for an award on our recognition program. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but when we can get ourselves to see greatness, see something we want to see more of in terms of behaviors or performance from people, and then automatically wire ourselves to do something about it or acknowledge it, that's when we're going to be able to really foster that authenticity.
Mm. I love that because Tim, if you remember, you had shared a story of Gallup gives out a quarterly award. Do you remember telling the story? And then somebody asked, why don't you think I got it? Can you tell that story?
Jane Miller, who is the president of Gallup and the chief operating officer, she would be the MC of awards for many years. And yeah, she would say, if you're not getting enough recognition, you're probably not giving enough recognition. And sometimes we kind of sit back and wait for it to happen and wonder why we're getting passed over and all this kind of thing. And in the meantime, we're contributing nothing to a culture of recognition. And I mean, when we're recording this, we're kind of getting towards the holiday season, and, people who give recognition get benefit from that as well. When you do something nice for others, it feels good for you as well. If you're having a bad day, go do something nice for somebody, and it usually pulls you out of the funk as well. And so I think there's kind of there's some interesting Don Clifton talked about a dipper and a bucket, and there's a metaphor around that, around recognition. And I remember him talking about the hydraulics of the dipper and the bucket, where it just doesn't make sense. But when you give, your bucket kind of refills as well. It's just kind of part of the magic virtuous cycle there. So yeah, thanks for jogging my memory on that. I think that's great advice. If you're not getting enough recognition, you're probably not giving enough recognition.
And I remember when you said that to me, like the next morning I went for a run and I couldn't stop thinking about that. And another thing that I just add to that as an and is I think if you're not giving enough recognition, you're not getting enough recognition as a result of not being someone safe to give recognition to because you've never seen them give it to others. Meaning that, like, some people are really good with compliments, some are not. And then you get these weird narratives in your head for the people who are not, and you think like, well, like you said, they never say anything to me, so I'm not going to say anything to them. And I think that's kind of an easy bump that you can move forward with.
And Ted, you're an expert about this, and that's well documented. Given you won the Gallup Exceptional Workplace Award, your organization did, and your leadership really led to that. And you've coached and consulted with a lot of districts that are getting a lot better around this. I think at the core, it's not just a well-intentioned principal or CEO or manager who can create this. We have to create the conditions for other people to get on board with it as well. And so it's not all about manager has to recognize employees weekly or your score on this won't go up. We got to think about all the different forms of recognition. I mean, a third grade teacher, recognition could be a parent who catches them in the hallway, and it's not a bad thing, right? It could be a colleague who says, hey, I don't know what was going on next door today, but boy, it sure sounded like you created an engaging environment there. In fact, you were so loud, you distracted us, but whatever you were doing, there's a lot of different types of recognition that can happen. Managers need to create the conditions for recognition to occur, but it doesn't always come from the manager to the employee. It's got to come from a lot of directions.
Yeah, 100%. And there's so many ways that different strengths can tie into that to help that. I mean, I don't think there's one of the 34 where you couldn't design and develop an intentional process to support the recognition of others. So Emily, with that, tell us a little bit about what the research says about fulfilling. So that's where it starts. Pillar number 1 is fulfilling. What is that? Give me some depth on that to help the listeners understand that.
So that is whether or not someone strongly agrees to this statement. I get the right amount of recognition for the work that I do. We were very intentional when we wrote that statement. Then that caveat for the work that I do is really important because we know some people, regardless of what they're doing, want more recognition than other people. Humans innately have that drive for it, but it's really about that feeling. We didn't ask how often they're getting, well, we did in other parts of the research, but for this fulfilling aspect, it's really about, do they feel like they're getting enough? This one is actually lower than the percent who strongly agree to our authenticity. It's only 22% in 2024. So 22% of the US workforce feels like they're getting the right amount of recognition for the work that they do. Yikes. But when we unpack this more, the sentiment behind this is such a strong driver of engagement. Out of all the 5 pillars, this one has the biggest correlation with engagement. It's because it has a lot to do with how people are feeling about their jobs, how they're feeling about the way people are interacting with them at their jobs. I mean, it feels crummy to do great work and then feel like no one appreciates you for it. And that's a really scary undertone that can drive a lot of disengagement that we see in the workforce.
How do you think that is impacted by age? Do you have that data that kind of breaks it down by, 25 to 35s?
So the percent who strongly agree to this doesn't shuffle a lot by age. There's not really any huge differences based on age about whether people feel like they're getting the right amount of recognition. We did do some generational research on recognition with WorkHuman and found that younger people slightly but negligibly say they want a little bit more recognition than people from older generations do. But the differences are small enough that it's not, people want to point to those differences and say younger people are so, they need so much more attention, they need so much more recognition. But the data that we've got doesn't, shows that there's a small difference, but it doesn't really support that narrative to the extent that people are talking about it.
Yeah, and the reason I asked is, and is I jumped to a conclusion there, which was that when I was younger, which in certain audiences I still am young, very few, but when I was younger, I needed more of that reinforcement and what you're describing as fulfilling, just to make sure I knew I was doing the right job.
Yeah.
As I aged through experience and growth of wisdom and, making mistakes and learning, I didn't really need it as much because I could tell myself my lane. And that's why I wonder that, because you read a lot of really cool stuff from Gen Z, and Gallup's got a really neat report on that too. But I would think there'd be a natural correlation there. The younger, just not being needy, but needing, to know where their guardrails are.
Yeah. Well, I think it ties perfectly back to the conversation we were having earlier about clear expectations. In our research, we're seeing this feedback loop with recognition where if I recognize you or thank you or express my gratitude for you doing something, that's a signal to you that that's something you should be doing again and that you should be doing more of. So recognition is an example of ways to set clear expectations. Tim, you did such a great job in that presentation because you did X, Y, and Z. You now know that X, Y, and Z are expectations for when you present if they weren't made explicitly clear beforehand. So I think this feedback loop, Ted, you described it perfectly when you're newer in your career, when you're maybe a little bit younger, maybe feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome early in your career, needing that development, that feedback really helps you know what it is you're doing best because you're getting recognition for that, but also helps you know what you should be doing next to continue growing in your career.
And I would just offer, and I would love to hear both of your responses to this, a caution for the listeners of overcorrecting when you hear Emily talk about these 5 pillars. And the reason is I worked with a school district probably 7 years ago, 8 years ago now, and they had done the initial engagement survey using the Q12. They came in at about 24% actively disengaged, which kind of stunned me because I was like, holy moly, this is a problem, right? So we coached through, take your 2 lowest, let's design and develop some strategies. And then the administrators, the managers went out like robots because one of them was, have you gotten feedback or reinforcement, et cetera? And they went out like robots and they're like, look at you doing a good job. So proud of you. Here is a star. Well, then they took it again in spring and they were enjoying about 24% engagement. Okay. And I'm being very sarcastic with enjoying. They dropped to 9%
Yikes.
engaged and they went to like 40% active disengagement. And the principals and the district administrator were like, what do you think happened? I said, what did you guys do? Like, what were you doing with this? Well, we were telling everybody every day. We were very intentional. So like overcorrecting can lead you to a consequence that you are not seeing. What are your thoughts on that? And like, how do we avoid that?
I'm so glad you brought this up because recognition is very important. But if it sounds like this district or the managers maybe were doing it inauthentically. They were doing it as that checklist. Okay, we're going to tell everybody every single day that we appreciate them for what they're doing. And as Tim mentioned earlier, a lot of how we respond to questions about recognition have to do with, okay, can I even remember a time, when I was recently recognized? If they're not doing the recognition authentically, that's going to feel uncomfortable to the people who are receiving it. And they're going to start questioning the trust in the leaders who are giving that recognition. They're going to wonder, do they actually see me teaching? Do they actually know what I'm doing? Because if they're giving recognition with this frequency, as often as they are, with as little specificity as they are, I don't believe that they're actually giving me real recognition or appreciation. And that undermines all of the efforts, but also makes me feel worse than had they just ignored me in the first place. So I think that's why authenticity is such an important part of these pillars. Yeah, if you try, going to make it super fulfilling, giving everybody a ton, try to make it super personalized, that's awesome. Those efforts are going to be great and hopefully work well for you. But if it's not authentic or if you're missing that equitable piece or it's not organically a part of your culture, it's not going to reap the benefits you want it to. These 5 pillars really need to be in balance. So while I would encourage listeners to think a little more critically about how they are giving recognition as it relates to these, 5 pillars. If you overdo it in one pillar, you're probably not going to get the benefits you're after.
Well, in just one more discussion point on this with both of you is equitable. I mean, I could see active disengagement driving hard, having the Loraxes on your staff who feel they speak to everyone, making things worse because you're out there trying to give everyone recognition, and there are undeserved people getting recognition, and then you're standing there looking over at it like, oh my goodness, and that driving it the wrong way. So when we talk about equitable, like where does that go? What do we do with that?
Tim, do you want to take this one or do you want me to keep blabbing on?
Go ahead. I can add.
All right. Well, in terms of equitable, this is, I mentioned this earlier, not about everyone getting the same amount of recognition. It's about whether people who are doing, a similar level of performance get similar recognition as each other. So let's say Tim and I both do a presentation for a client. He crushes it and I just fail miserably. If we have the same manager and our manager says, Tim, great job on your presentation. You really crushed it, made a big impact on the client. And then she says the same thing to me, Emily, great job. You really crushed it. You made a big impact on the client. Tim, I don't want to speak for you, Tim, but I'm guessing you're going to look at my level of effort and you're going to say, wait, I could have done that bad of a job and still got this praise. That's going to demotivate you because you know that you can get praise for doing good work or for doing bad work. And that's not what we want. Now, the other side of this coin is that if I'm doing tremendous work and I'm getting a lot done and I'm going above and beyond, I'm making a huge impact on my clients, and Tim over here is slacking, or Tim, maybe we'll give him a break. We'll say Tim's doing an average job, but Tim is getting a bunch of praise and he's the manager's favorite, and they have a history. He's worked here for so long. Everybody loves him. He always wins the prizes and gets the most awards because he's so likable. Like, that's going to make me feel bad. I'm going to be looking at Tim and Tim's projects. I'm going to say, Tim's not doing as much as me. I'm way better than Tim. And that's going to make me want to leave my organization to find another company that actually values and respects me for the work that I'm doing. So, and I will say, I love working with Tim. Tim's great, has no performance issues. So
yeah, I thought you were talking about like Tim Miller, not Tim Hodges.
Oh yeah. No, never Tim Hodges.
That guy's a slacker, that Miller.
I think on all of this, the thing we've learned is that what we're measuring here is not managers' intentions. What we're measuring is employees' perceptions. And people are messy. I would know because I'm one of them, right? That we have to individualize. We've got to drill down into what does this really mean for you? But that's where I love that question. What would a 5 like? Or how could we improve this element of engagement for you specifically? Don't worry about everybody else, just for you specifically, and kind of build a model of what success looks like. But again, well-intentioned managers and principals and executives, do everything they can to address these needs. And sometimes it doesn't work because the employee is not getting what they need out of that. So what does recognition mean for me? It's different than what it means for either of you. In the last 6 months, someone at work has talked to me about my progress is another question on the survey. Maybe it literally happened and we were both there when it happened. So why wouldn't you give a 5? Well, maybe I was just going through the rubric that the school board or the district office requires me to do, and it didn't really feel developmental for you. So again, it's kind of finicky, and I always encourage people, try not to be defensive when you go into these conversations. Try and stay curious and figure out what could look better about this for you, and really drill down across the different pillars of engagement and recognition both.
Yeah, I love that point because I think the whole world also doesn't get to go through like correlation training to make sure that everybody sees a 5 is a 5 is a 5. And there's another program that I work with called EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating Systems, and they have an end of meeting scoring. And at the end of the meeting, they say, and my friend Jason just taught me this, if you don't score at a 10, you have to explain why you didn't score at a 10. So we always look at these scales of 5 as like, you got to earn that 5, right? Well, but sometimes it's like, if it's not a 5, then explain why so we can rapidly improve for you, opposed to wondering what's in your brain. And that's why I like this principles of fulfilling, authentic, equitable, embedded in the culture, and personalized to support recognition. It's so powerful because if you're not thinking of those different elements, I think you can actually drive a little bit of burnout and disengagement with managers who are out there doing their best to hurrah and farumph and I got you cupcakes and I bought you this and what the hell's wrong with everybody? I'm trying my best and it's me instead of, them. So I hope that the listeners really walk away with that research and that point. So going on to the next thing here, because we only have a couple minutes left. Tim, what is some really cool learning that you are experiencing, through data research, working with students that we could all learn and grow from as smart thinkers?
One thing that I really appreciate that has really caught on lately is the domains among your top 5 strengths, right? So there's executing, influencing, relationship building, strategic thinking. Those are the 5 or the 4 talent domains. But there was an article that Benjamin Erickson Farr wrote that's really done well on the Gallup website, and you can find it easily. It's around what does that say about your leadership style? So it's things like if you lead with a lot of executing talent, that's a strong domain for you. Maybe you're a process-oriented leader, and Emily, you even kind of referred to that earlier. That's kind of the default for you. If you lead with a lot of influencing talent, maybe you're an impact-oriented leader. If you lead with a lot of relationship building talent, you're a people-oriented leader. And if you lead with a lot of the strategic thinking, you're a thought-oriented leader. And in that article, and maybe we can link to it in the show notes, they go into what are some of the benefits of leading out of that domain, and also what are some of the things you need to watch out for, you need to be careful about. Maybe you lead with a lot of executing talent and you're so focused on the process that you can tend to forget about people, or the opposite. You lead with so much relationship building talent that you lack a little performance orientation because you just want to make sure everybody's okay. But we need a balance of those, and we need to draw in other complementary partners. So I think that the leadership styles that are kind of underneath the domains are really helpful. So that's one thing I think's been getting a lot of attention lately, and I'm glad to see it.
And tell us again, who is the author?
Benjamin Erickson Farr. And I believe the article is just called "The Strengths of Leadership." But it's really, I can send you a link to it.
Yeah. Oh no, I'll find it. I have got my Gallup access. I'll download it and I'll send it out to the listeners. And Emily, how about you? What is something you are working on or learning about that's helpful for all of us?
Oh man, I think so many exciting things. One of the things that I've been spending a lot of time on, and I know, Ted, I previewed some of the research this past summer at that conference that you attended at University of Nebraska Clifton Strengths Institute. But one of the things that we've been working a lot on is understanding what types of strengths-based programming help college students the most, what is most effective for them, or is it a certain combination of things? One of the biggest insights we've found so far, and it seems so simple, but it's one of those things that is really driving an impact. The number of different types of people that someone talks to about their strengths is one of the biggest predictors of whether or not they're going to have an impact through Clifton Strengths. So that doesn't mean, I'm talking to 6 friends. It means if I talk to 6 different types of people, that could be one of my professors, my roommate, a family member, maybe my husband, maybe a mentor that I have, and diversifying the conversations you're having with people about your strengths really drives a lot of that impact, because you're getting that feedback from the other people who know you in different areas of your life. And you're able to really pull and triangulate that information together to build that stronger picture of who you are and how you interact best with other people who are very different from each other. So I've been diving really deep into the analytics on those experiences as they relate to, Clifton Strengths for college students. And we will be publishing more of our findings in Q1, Q2 timeline of 2025. So happy to share that when it's ready.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love I mean, that's so applicable to everybody, right? The more people you talk to the more people you talk to about your strengths, the more reinforcement you have, the more everything you have about your strengths, the more awareness you have, the more you'll lean into them. It's something that I end all of my executive team meetings with a conversation of where did we see people operating in their strengths? So one of the guys on my team, Mike, he laminated everybody's, 34, and you'll be sitting in the meeting and I have a dry erase marker with me and I'll like dot when I see it from my team members, because I think the powerful thing that can increase your own personal engagement, but then the engagement of the organization, is when you constantly have these in front of you, like you just said. And you know, we'll end a meeting and there was some conflict in the meeting, and I'll say with like, look, he was leading with being deliberative. You were leading with, you know, being usually it's something like it's a relationship piece. It's individualization or input. You want more people to have more conversations, and he's over there like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Like I just need to get this done. And I'm so proud of you too for you know advocating from where you know in your area of strength. But to take a 19-year-old, you know, man, woman, or person and have them just like understand that going into their formative life. That's one thing I love about, you know, what goes on at Nebraska at the university there with the kids, you know, taking their strengths, having seniors who are their coaches. Tim, talk to us about that, because I mean, I'm trying to figure out a way to get that to happen in like the 6th through 12th grade world. Tell us what goes on there.
Well, in a previous episode, we talked about my upbringing in a rural school. So you can go back and listen to that if you're interested. But, you know, the lessons I learned there are part of the model that we implement here. When I was a kid in a one-room school, I was the only kid in my class. Say I was in 3rd grade. Part of my day would be practicing reading out loud to a 7th grader. And, you know, there was kind of that near peer relationship. Same thing happens here on campus, where the assessment is not the intervention. We love to assess people's strengths and give them the report and do some self-analysis and reflection. But the magic of the course I teach is not my amazing lectures. It's the one-on-one coaching that the students get from an upper class student who just shows up, is curious, is interested in them. To your point earlier about affirmation, I mean, calls out some things that they see in them. And I had a student here for an interview the other day who was just, you could tell they're about 3 inches taller than they were when the semester started, because of the way they've grown in their confidence based on feedback they received from their coach that maybe no one else ever had. I love to ask the question sometimes, who's the first person outside your family who really noticed that you were special? I mean, because hopefully most people come from a family environment where that's true, but you know, who are some of those people that speak that life into you? And for a lot of students on campus, it is their strengths coach. They're not just a TA in a class. They're someone who's interested in me. And then I see them at the union and they remember my name, and that means even more. It's easy on a big institution campus to get lost in the shuffle and feel like you're just a student ID and not a real person. But our coaching program really does catch people, you know, that positive behavior modification, just been a theme throughout our conversation today, but catches people at their best and really encourages them to grow into that. So it's a thrill to get to be a part of it.
And as we close out here, Emily and Tim, I'm both going to ask you the same question. Anything that you thought of in prepping for this conversation today that you want to add as a little extra flavor as we close out?
Absolutely, because I lead with input, so I'm like over here, I'm walking encyclopedia of facts and data points. Ted, as I was prepping for this, one of the data points that kept coming up in my review was that 4 out of every 10 employees say that their job has a negative impact on their mental health. And I think our conversation today about recognizing, appreciating each other, giving each other opportunities to use our strengths and identifying and affirming that in each other, I think is going to go a long way in helping reduce that number. We're going to be measuring it again here in an upcoming survey, and I'm hoping it goes down, because it's sad and kind of staggering to see that, you know, there are a lot of organizations that are sadly not making people's lives better for working there, and that's what I know we're all trying to turn around.
I love that you brought that up, Emily, because I think one of the things I am most excited about in the future, and every once in a while I start thinking to myself, I wish I had a lot more runway on my like career of leadership, is we are now talking about that. Mm-hmm. That was ignored when I was a young man. Like, rub a little dirt on it, bucko, and get, you know, put on your boots and get your ass to work kind of thing. Now it's like, listen, what can we do in the workplace, recognizing that we are literally a third of your waking day every day, a third of your day every day. What can we do to support your mental fitness? And how can we create those conditions? And I just think this is fantastic. The future is so bright for younger people moving into the workplace that we're talking about this. It reminds me of when I first got into the workforce and they started to talk to us about our physical health. Like, hey, we're not going to serve donuts every day anymore because you're all dying and becoming diabetics. Well, now we've gotten that down, right? So we've demonstrated the care for the body because it reduces costs. Well, what about the brain and the heart? So thank you for bringing that up. Tim, thoughts on that or other things that you had prepped for?
Well, I'd just say there's only 3 people on this call, but there's 5 or 6 jobs represented. Some of us have multiple roles that we play in life. And I hope that people hear how much we each love what we get to do. And so, Emily, it's hard to hear the statistics of what normal looks like. I don't want to be normal if that's what normal is. My work experiences have almost all been wonderful. I think you find a good job and then you got to put in the work it takes to make it a great job. Maybe my parting comment, Ted, would just be that, all the things we've talked about, whether it's strengths or engagement, people think that means buy a code, go online, fill out a thing, go to a meeting, and then you're done with that. And you'll hear people all the time, and in air quotes, we did strengths or we did the Q12. This is a process, not an event. Maybe there are some events along the way, but if the only time you think about engagement is when a consultant's in the room with your team, or the only time you think about strengths is when, there's an event on the calendar, we're probably not quite turning the knob enough, right? We've got to make this a part of the process. The way we just integrate this into how we view ourselves and others and how we show up at work and everywhere else we go. So my hope, there are some events that are really engaging. And so, yeah, do those, but make sure this isn't a check off the box activity. It's got to be a mindset that you have. And I know many of your listeners are in that space already. So just want to be encouraging about that.
Yeah, I am 100% with you. Like when I'm around people who say, I just don't have time to keep working with that. Every time I've ever heard someone say I don't have time, I replace the word time with value. I don't value enough to do something with it. And if it's a system, like a launch or we're going to all do this and you don't buy into it, I get that. But your presence then can be disengaging. So, making the time to understand yourself so that you can grow and be the best version of yourself is really powerful. And that's what we do, Emily, Tim. We charge into the storms that we face with a lot of resilience and perseverance and empathy and understanding. So I can't thank you two enough here. And the one thing I just did want to correct for people who have not heard before, Tim Hodges is not 400 years old living in a sod house as a child. He grew up in rural Nebraska on a pig farm in the 70s and 80s in a small area. So it's not like he went to this one-room schoolhouse with the Waltons out in the prairie back in the day, which that's a deep cut with the Waltons, you and Jason Bateman. Tim's muted, so we can't hear him laughing at my joke. But Emily and Tim, thank you so much for giving me some time. This will be a great segment for our listeners, especially those people who are listening to the podcast and really focus on strengthening themselves every day, either through Clifton or other processes. And most importantly, the fact that engagement is a choice. And when you're working into the conditions, you can choose into working with the conditions that management picks and supports for you. Or like Tim said, find a job that you love. So Emily and Tim, I really, really appreciate you guys giving me some time. I'm looking forward to seeing you both in the next couple of months. Emily will be in Oshkosh, Wisconsin here, working with us at the mid-year Smart Thinking Retreat, which you can still register for. And Tim's my guest speaker for our staff in service. So I can't wait to see both of you. So thank you both very much for your time today.
Thanks, Ted.
Thanks for having us, Ted.
You're welcome. So let's do some smart thinking. I just have one question for you. What are you going to do with your strengths and your new knowledge to support others by increasing your feedback to them so that it's fulfilling, authentic, equitable, embedded, and personalized? That's it. That's the Smart Thinking Podcast. Hey, as always, thank you for listening. And please make sure to share and rate this episode on whichever platform you listen to it on. And remember that I thrive on hearing back from you and learning what you're doing with your new knowledge from the Smart Thinking Podcast. So thank you to you for always sending me great notes. Also, January 30th in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, I'll be hosting the mid-year Smart Thinking Retreat around employee well-being and engagement, and Emily is going to be our keynote speaker. So if you're interested in that, go to the CISA 6 webpage or contact me for information on how to register. And I want to end here, because this has been quite a long episode, with two things. Thank you for listening to this, and a reminder of the power of your ability to influence other people. Because remember, a leader is anyone with influence over another person, and you are a leader. Because every single moment of every single day, you have the ability to change the direction of someone else. And I want to share a quick story to close this out to prove it. So many of you know that I am pretty fortunate to be married to a middle school language arts teacher. I have a son now that is a middle school social studies teacher, and my daughter is going to school to be a middle school or high school history teacher. A couple of days ago, we were sitting around the kitchen table, and my son came home, and my wife leaned into him and said, "Did you tell your dad what happened at school today?" And of course, having been an administrator, a principal, and a middle school teacher once in my life, it got my curiosity, sparked it, and I turned and looked at him and said, "What happened?" Of course, my narrative immediately went to something negative, and instead he smiled and he said, "No, something pretty cool happened today." He explained to me that at his school, their principal has a culture, or their district has a culture, where they have something called the gratitude gram. And he was walking down the hallway and went into his room, and he got a gratitude gram handed to him from a colleague. There was a small little package, and inside was a coffee cup and a note that was thanking him for bringing his energy and ideas to the school. It was longer than that, but that's basically the gist of what he told me. I then asked him, "How did it make you feel?" And what he did was he told me that it made him feel awesome. It made him feel grateful to her, and it reminded him why he became a teacher. It was awesome because it was not forced. She did it on her own. I'm literally reading these words off of a card that he gave me when I asked him if he could explain to me what it was. And after listening to Emily and Tim on this podcast, remember, it's about making people feel like fulfilled, and that the feedback was authentic, and that it was personalized. Like Tim said, if you're not getting a lot of recognition, you might not be giving a lot of recognition. And the only way we can fundamentally change the behavior of others is if we first change our own. See the storm, face the storm, and charge into the storm.
It's cold and terrible weather, but I feel as light as a feather. Snowed in the weekend next to you.
Bourbon and honey together, I can't think of anything better. Snowed in the weekend next to you. Kokomo just doesn't cut it. Maui's nice in summer, but it's coziest when it's snowed in next to you. Dancing to Louie and Ella, no shoes, you're my Cinderella. Snowed in the weekend next to you. This time you know I can tell her, darling, you're my kind of fella. Snowed in the weekend next to you. Kokomo just doesn't cut it. Maui's nice in summer, but it's coziest when it's snowed in next to you. You and I spent winter dancing, held up in the cold romance, and snowed in for the weekend here with you. Kokomo just doesn't cut it.